During the Battle of France in May and June of 1940, the French had only one aircraft technically capable of going toe-to-toe with the formidable German Messerschmitt Bf-109E, and that was the Dewoitine D-520. However, the French Air Force had a critically low number of these fighters at their disposal. Meanwhile, the Messerschmitt formed the backbone of most German fighter squadrons. The rest of the French inventory fell far short. Based on their flight and combat characteristics, aircraft like the Caudron C-714 and French Bloch MB.152 could really only compete with the older Messerschmitt Bf-109B or C variants. The Marane-Saulnier MS-406, the Curtiss Hawk 75, and the French Bloch MB.152 fared marginally better. These could actually hold their own against the Bf-109D. But the bitter truth was that during the German Blitzkrieg, the Luftwaffe had already phased those outdated models out of frontline service. French pilots were highly skilled and fought with incredible bravery, but no amount of courage could make up for the technical and often tactical inferiority of their aircraft. Take the MB-152, for example. It was one of the most widely used French fighters in May and June of 1940. There were attempts to replace it with more modern designs. However, the process started way too late. Compared to other French fighters of the era, the MB-152 proved to be the least successful in a dogfight. It suffered absolutely catastrophic losses. Why did this happen? The fighter's main drawbacks were its short range and extremely poor high-altitude maneuverability. On top of that, its guns frequently jammed or froze up at altitude. This left pilots completely defenseless. On the flip side, the MB-152 did have its strong points. It was a rugged airframe that could handle significantly higher G-loads than many other aircraft of its day. It was also considered an excellent stable gun platform. It could pick up speed very quickly in a steep dive. The history of the fighter began with the first prototype, assembled in a Paris suburb in October 1938. Its main upgrade over its predecessor, the MB-151, was a more powerful Gnome-Rhone 14N21 radial engine. This engine produced 1,030 horsepower. Thanks to this power plant, the fighter could hit a top speed of 323 miles per hour. This was achieved at an altitude of around 16,400 feet. The designers offered two armament options. The first was a set of four 7.5mm MAC machine guns with 500 rounds per gun. This was a huge step up from the previous model. The second featured two 20mm Hispano-Suiza HS-404 cannons with 60 rounds each. It also included two 7.5mm machine guns. In actual combat, the MB-152 was almost exclusively equipped with this heavier-hitting loadout. The prototype made its maiden flight in December 1938, with test pilot René Blanc at the controls. By January of the following year, engineers were prepping the aircraft for mass production. They decided to swap the original engine for a slightly different model. This was the Gnome-Rhone 14N25, delivering 1,000 horsepower. But this is where they hit a major snag. Just like the previous version, the new engine suffered from severe overheating at full throttle. This drastically limited the aircraft's top speed, keeping it under 292 miles per hour. Throughout 1939, designers desperately tried to solve the overheating issue. They began flight testing a variety of propellers and engine cowlings. They tested cowlings with maximum diameters ranging from 31 to 39 inches. Time was running out, and the Air Force was waiting for its new fighters. To avoid derailing the delivery schedule for the first production MB-152s, the engineers were forced to act. They had to fit a massive cowling over 39 inches in diameter. While this fix did save the radial engine from overheating, it completely ruined the aircraft's aerodynamics. As a result, the fighter's flight performance dropped below even the bare minimum specs demanded by the military contracts. After a series of intense and grueling flight tests, the refined prototype was finally approved for full-scale production. It officially entered service with the French Air Force in mid-May 1940, right in the thick of the fighting. In parallel, work was underway on the next variant, the MB-153. Assembled in the fall of 1938, this version was fitted with an American Pratt & Whitney R1830SC-3G twin Wasp engine. It was paired with a Hamilton standard propeller. The aircraft made its first flight in April 1939. After that, it went through rigorous official trials. It received many of the design changes that had already been successfully implemented on the MB.151 and MB.152 prototypes. You might read in some historical sources that the sole MB.153 prototype was completely destroyed in May 1940. This happened after the pilot accidentally hit a large bomb crater while landing. But in reality, the story of the fighter did not end there. The aircraft was repaired. By the end of May, it was returned to service. Later on, it even saw action with the Vichy French Air Force after the fall of France. Engineers also planned to create a subsequent version of the fighter, the MB.154. However, this project never made it off the drawing board simply because the American Wright R1820 Cyclone engine ordered to power it never arrived. Eventually, production of the new French fighters was split across several major aviation plants. The initial plan called for a production run of 432 aircraft. These were divided into 3 equal batches. The first batch of 144 units consisted of the MB.151. The remaining 2 were made up of the more powerful MB.152. These MB.152s differed from one another only in their use of different subvariants of the Gnome-Rhone 14N engine. Production and record-keeping at the Bloch Company were notoriously chaotic. Serial numbers for the MB.151 and MB.152 were assigned from a single shared block. They were completely jumbled together, creating a massive headache in the technical documentation. Assembly of these combat aircraft took place at several different factories across France. Some airframes were put together in Courbevoie, while others were built in Châteauroux and Bordeaux-Mérignac. It was not until January 1940 that the process was finally streamlined. All new aircraft, including an additional large order for 100 MB.152s, started being delivered exclusively from the Châteauroux plant. The pre-production MB.151 had made its first flight back in December 1938. However, the French Air Force did not officially accept the aircraft into service until early spring on March 7th. By mid-May, the supply situation was incredibly tight. Just over 24 aircraft of both variants had rolled off the assembly line. Only 10 of them had actually been accepted by the military. But the worst was yet to come. The initial large-scale operational trials revealed a major issue. Fielding these fighters in combat squadrons was simply unsafe and nearly impossible. The main culprit was a serious flaw in the tail assembly. Because of this, the manufacturer had to urgently recall over 150 of the first production fighters. This massive retrofit was required before the Air Force would even accept them. Given these technical issues, the baseline MB.151 was mostly relegated to pilot training. By the start of World War II, only a single fighter group had actually managed to receive the newer, slightly more capable MB.152s. This group was based out of Étampes-Mondessier. By the time war was officially declared, the factories had managed to roll out a total of 249 aircraft. But the actual operational readiness numbers were pretty grim. Out of the 123 accepted airframes, the Air Force only received 66 MB.152s and 50 MB.151s. And here is an absurd detail. Most of those 50 fighters were delivered to frontline squadrons completely missing their propellers. Because even the new MB.152s were technically unsafe for actual air combat, the frontline fighter groups were forced to face the war flying hopelessly obsolete D-18 D-510s. The first upgraded and at least somewhat airworthy MB.152s only started reaching the Armée de l'Air, the French Air Force, in late September. By that time, the military had taken delivery of over 150 of these aircraft in a bizarre mix of configurations. 47 airframes were still sitting on the tarmac missing their props. The rest were fitted with completely different propellers. Some had 4-blade, fixed pitch props made by Chauvière. Others had Gnome-Rhone 2590M engines and props. And yet another batch got a different modification of the Chauvière Type 371 prop. It was not until closer to November that combat squadrons were finally able to receive complete batches of these fighters to meet their needs. When the pilots finally got to put the aircraft through its paces in the air, it became glaringly obvious that the fighter was a complete failure. Frustrated pilots immediately gave it the derogatory nickname avion à quatre mains. This literally translates from French as the four-handed airplane. And there was a very good reason for this. During a steep dive, the fighter had a terrifying tendency to violently pitch down on its own into a near vertical drop. Just imagine what was happening in that cramped cockpit. To avoid crashing, the pilot had to hold the stick in a death grip with his right hand. He constantly had to work the throttle with his left hand. He also needed to adjust the prop pitch in time to keep the engine from over-revving, and he somehow had to crank the elevator trim wheel all at the exact same time. It turned a routine flight into an extreme endurance test. As for the earlier MB.151 model, several dozen of these aircraft, mostly equipped with fixed pitch wooden props, were sent to fighter pilot training centers in Chartres and Étampes. Through late 1939 and the first few months of 1940, these airplanes continued to be distributed in large numbers to various regional squadrons in Villacoublay, Rouen, Lyon, and Le Havre. Since they were completely useless for serious air combat, they served exclusively as stopgap trainers until the units could finally transition to more modern, capable aircraft. During the winter of 1939 to 1940, Fighter Group GC-18 was stationed at the French city of Marignan. At the time, their fleet consisted of 16 DY-10 D-501 and 8 D-510 fighters, flying patrols from Hyères to Dijon-Longvic. Their first 4 new MB-152s did not arrive until late December 1939. After spending some time operating out of Cherbourg and Languedoc-Poulmic, the group was transferred directly to the front lines in late March 1940. They were stationed at the Villaines-en-Haye airfield. Later on, another fighter group, GC-28, which operated closely with the Navy flying twin-engine Potez 631s, also left its peacetime base in Marignan. Teaming up with Aéronaval, French Naval Aviation, squadrons at Calais-Marc, they decided to completely overhaul their fleet. The pilots traded in their old Potez 631s and transitioned to the newer single-engine Bloch 152 fighters. Initially, these aircraft suffered from a major technical flaw. Their Gnome-Rhone 14 N25 and 35 engines were constantly overheating. However, engineers managed to partially solve the problem by redesigning the cowling air intakes. Eventually, this successful modification was gradually rolled out to all operational aircraft. This significantly improved their in-flight reliability. By mid-September 1939, with the threat of a major war looming, the government placed an urgent additional order for over 500 MB-152 fighters. The plans were truly ambitious. This was meant to be just the first step toward a huge contract for 1,725 of these aircraft and their variants. But reality set in. By November, this ambitious plan was scrapped in favor of a more realistic batch of 690 fighters. Meanwhile, manufacturers were still working through the initial order for 144 Bloch 151 aircraft. They were allocated like this. 90 aircraft went to the training units of the French Air Force, the Armée de l'Air. 25 were handed over to naval aviation. Another 25 were sold to Greece, and 4 were kept at the factory for testing. Later on, to replace those 4 test airframes, the company built 4 of the newer MB-152s. By January 10th, the situation in the French Air Force was becoming critical. They had taken delivery of 138 MB-151 fighters, but 62 of them were grounded due to various technical issues. The situation was not much better for the 274 new MB-152s. A total of 170 aircraft equipped with the 14 N25 engine simply did not have propellers or were fitted with completely inadequate temporary substitutes. A little earlier in October, the Air Force had taken delivery of a batch of 82 MB-152s with a much better configuration. These were powered by the more powerful Gnome-Rhone 14 N49 engines paired with reliable Chauvière 371 propellers. You could spot these fighters by their updated engine cowlings. These featured cowlings roughly 33.5 inches in diameter. Engineers cleverly copied the exhaust system from the American Curtiss Hawk 75 fighter. It featured twin exhaust stacks at the bottom of the cowling. On top of that, the aircraft were fitted with bulkier oil coolers that provided about 125 square inches of cooling area. In early 1940, the French High Command made a tough call. They completely halted the assembly of 60 MB.152 fighters that were less than halfway finished. The decision was made to focus on more advanced variants. The next batches of MB.152s, powered by the 14N49 engine, featured a heavily modified tail section. Air Force headquarters openly stated that only these updated aircraft were truly fit for the rigors of combat and should be delivered to frontline units. Another major upgrade in these later production runs was a rudder trim tab that pilots could easily adjust on the ground as well as in flight. Development did not stop there. Soon, the newer MB.155 model began rapidly pushing the older MB.152s off the assembly lines at the Châteauroux factory. Because of this, the military had to quickly overhaul all of its fighter delivery schedules. Looking back at the original pre-war plans, France had intended to acquire 294 aircraft. These were mostly Bloch 151 and Bloch 152 models. However, after a series of changes and rewritten contracts, the final procurement numbers for these fighters looked quite different. The military ultimately received 200 MB.152 fighters equipped with the Gnome-Rhone 14N25 engine. Another 88 aircraft of the same type were fitted with a different power plant, the 14N29. Exactly 200 fighters rolled out of the factories with the most successful engine of the bunch, the 14N49. On top of that, using the older models as a baseline, engineers built 3 experimental pre-production prototypes of the brand new MB.155 aircraft. By May 10, 1940, tensions in Europe had reached a boiling point. At that time, the French Air Force had taken delivery of 140 MB.151s and 363 of the newer MB.152s. Another 16 airframes were delivered to the Navy, and 7 were en route to Greece. Even though 37 outdated MB.151s and a reserve of 10 aircraft were still active in frontline units, High Command planned to place them in storage. This was to happen as soon as their pilots transitioned to the more modern MB.152s. But the rollout of the new fighters was not exactly going smoothly either. Out of the existing fleet of 360 MB.152s, the majority had the older 14N25 engines, 195 to be exact. Meanwhile, only 165 fighters were equipped with the more powerful 14N49s. Worse still, among these newer fighters, the General Staff considered only the 80 aircraft delivered by early March to be fully operational. However, they had no choice. Due to a desperate shortage of equipment, the French had to keep even those non-standard Bloch 152s in their combat squadrons. They kept them even though they fell well short of operational requirements. In the end, the units assigned to fly the MB-152 could only muster 93 fully combat-ready aircraft. Another 53 airframes were held in reserve, or were temporarily down for maintenance. On the eve of these decisive clashes, the disposition of these aviation units broke down like this. Prior to the outbreak of major combat operations, the French Air Force dispersed its fighter squadrons to protect strategically important regions. For instance, a few fighter groups were based in the Calais area, as well as near Chantilly and Bouet. The latter was tasked with the critical defense of the skies over Paris. Other units were stationed in Rouen and Le Havre to cover the lower Seine region. Some squadrons were deployed to protect the industrial zones around Lyon. Around the same time, a newly formed Polish squadron began working up on a few MB-151s. Commanders planned to soon transition these pilots to the more modern MB-152 fighters. Meanwhile, at the airbase in Hyères, naval aviation pilots were also converting to new aircraft. They were preparing to trade their obsolete D-510 fighters for the new MB-152s. Another fighter group, formed in early 1940 in North Africa, arrived in France at the beginning of May. But they had left their MS-406 fighters behind at their old base. To equip these pilots, 30 brand new MB-152s were hastily assembled at a local aircraft plant by May 12th. After just a few days of familiarization training, this group deployed to reinforce the defenses of the capital. Interestingly, before the main German offensive kicked off, there were only a few minor engagements between the French MB.152s and the Luftwaffe. Throughout the entire period of the so-called phony war, only one air-to-air kill was officially recorded. On April 20th, over the town of Ozals, a French pilot named Amoureau finished off a German Ju-88 bomber. It had already been heavily damaged by anti-aircraft fire. In this video, we simply will not have time to cover the detailed history of every single unit that flew the MB-151 and MB-152 fighters. Suffice it to say that in the very first days of the German Blitzkrieg, French squadrons suffered catastrophic losses and heavy attrition. For example, by the evening of May 17th, the 5 squadrons in the northern zone had a total of only 44 fully operational MB-152s left. These were spread thin across various airfields. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and High Command was forced to urgently rush in reserves from other regions. At 7 in the morning on May 14th, 27 French MB-152 fighters launched on a high-stakes mission. They were providing air cover for an armored division counterattack in the Maubeuge-Charleroi sector. A flight of 9 aircraft bore the brunt of the fighting. During the intense dogfight, French pilots claimed 2 German Du-17 bombers and 4 Bf-109 fighters destroyed. 1 additional enemy aircraft was claimed as a probable, but the cost was steep. 6 MB-152s were shot down and another was heavily damaged. This left 1 French pilot dead and 4 wounded. A few days later, on May 17th, another group of 21 fighters was flying a combat air patrol. At the same time, 12 French Leo 451 bombers carried out strikes against enemy ground columns. This sortie turned into a disaster. Only 4 bombers and 7 MB-152s returned to base. 3 pilots were killed in action and 1 was wounded. It was the heaviest loss these units had suffered to date. This was especially true since the Germans lost only 2 aircraft in the engagement. These were 1 Bf-109 and 1 Bf-110. Another heavy fighter was claimed as a probable. Right around noon on June 3rd, the Luftwaffe launched a massive offensive. Almost every airfield around Paris was struck hard. Roughly 300 German bombers filled the skies. They were shielded by a heavy fighter escort of Bf-109s and Bf-110s. Of the squadrons defending the Paris region, only a handful of units scattered across various airfields were actually equipped with the MB-152. The French were severely handicapped by outdated tactics and poor early warning. Their fighters were forced to engage numerically superior forces the second they got airborne. This left them no time to climb and gain an altitude advantage. In the resulting furball, 9 MB-152s were destroyed and 3 were damaged. 6 pilots were killed and 3 more were wounded. In exchange, the defenders of Paris managed to shoot down just 4 enemy aircraft. These included 2 Bf-109s, 1 HE-111, and 1 Do-17. They also managed to damage 4 others. Overall, excluding a few airframes transferred to French naval aviation, frontline French Air Force units had 108 MB-152s in their active inventory. This was recorded between May 10th and May 31st. During the first 6 days of June, frontline units received an additional 84 replacement aircraft. However, the attrition rate was so high that by June 11th, only 25 mission-capable aircraft remained in reserve. This fell critically short. It was not nearly enough to replace combat losses, let alone stand up new squadrons. At the height of the campaign, French High Command desperately tried to plug the gaps. They did this by standing up additional units equipped with MB-151 and MB-152 fighters. By the end of May, several independent fighter flights had been formed. These were manned primarily by Polish volunteer pilots. These units were scattered across various French airfields with just a handful of airframes stationed at each base. Some true veterans flew in these engagements as well. For example, the commander of one of these units, Major Etilin, was a well-known World War I ace. He already had 22 aerial victories under his belt. On June 26th, he scored his 23rd kill. He downed one of 6 German He-111 bombers attempting to strike a local factory. Another newly formed group, flying out of Étampes, also managed to log at least 2 confirmed kills. In late May, a French fighter group flying MB.152s was temporarily based in England. They were stationed alongside reconnaissance units operating Potez 6311 aircraft. On May 30th, 13 MB.152s touched down at the British airfield at Lympne. From there, flying in formation with British Hurricanes, they escorted reconnaissance planes and naval dive bombers. They flew right into the heavily contested airspace over Dunkirk. After completing their combat sorties, these fighters returned to their home base in Deauville on June 4th. Meanwhile, after finishing their training at Lyon-Bron, 31 Polish pilots were sent to reinforce units equipped with MB.152 fighters. On June 13th, command made a critical decision. They opted to replace the underperforming Squadron C-714 fighters flown by one of the Polish squadrons with the more reliable MB.152. To transition to the new aircraft, some of the Polish pilots arrived at a base near Châteauroux. Meanwhile, the rest were transferred to nearby French units, but the situation at the front was falling apart fast. Just 4 days later, the Polish pilots were officially released from French service. They had already been forced to evacuate to England starting on June 15th. French naval aviation squadrons returning to Cherbourg after 3 weeks of grueling combat desperately needed to regroup. They had suffered heavy losses, including 8 of their twin-engine Potez 631s. The plan was to replace 6 MB.152 fighters and the surviving Potez 631s with brand-new, much more capable Dewoitine D-520 aircraft. One of the flights based at Marly-sur-Mer had also taken significant casualties. This flight was under the command of Lieutenant Commander de Lévy-Mirepoix. One of their MB.151 fighters failed to return from a routine reconnaissance sortie. On June 15th, a fierce dogfight broke out in the skies over Thiers between French MB.151s and Italian aircraft. It was in this exact engagement that French warrant officer Pierre Le Glouan truly cemented his legacy. The fight proved incredibly tough for the French, though. 2 MB.151s were shot down, and 3 more were heavily damaged. The Italians also took casualties. One enemy Fiat CR-42 biplane was rammed by a French naval pilot. The Italian fighter plummeted to the ground, crashing well short of its own border. Here is an interesting piece of history. Out of the 200 French aces who were credited with 4 or more aerial victories during the campaign, only 14 flew the MB.152. The most successful among them was 2nd Lieutenant Tholin, who logged a total of 8 enemy aircraft. Right alongside him were Sergeant Tellet and Captain Couteau, who also managed to secure 8 aerial victories of their own. As the Battle of France drew to its inevitable close, 9 squadrons equipped with MB.152s had to retreat to the south of the country to avoid capture. They scattered across various airfields such as Agen, Valençol, and Toulouse. Dozens of MB.152 and D-520 fighters were evacuated with them, as well as a unique MB.155 prototype belonging to Colonel Ronzet. With the exception of 4 MB.151 aircraft that managed to evacuate to Corsica, the Bloch family of fighters never crossed the Mediterranean. The main reason was their severely limited range, which simply made long over-water flights impossible. Records show that by early 1941, 5 MB.151 and MB.152 series aircraft had made their way to England. However, there is no evidence that the Free French forces ever flew them in combat. The overall statistics for these aircraft are pretty bleak. More than 600 airframes were accepted into service by the French Air Force. This included the MB.151, the MB.152, and a few rare variants like the MB.153 and MB.155. Out of all these, only about 320 remained in service by the end of June 1940. In just 6 weeks of intense fighting, the French Air Force lost around 270 Bloch fighters. They were either destroyed in combat or abandoned on the ground during the retreat. Ultimately, they fell into enemy hands. In August 1940, a significant number of French fighter groups had to be disbanded. Under the strict terms of the armistice, the Vichy French Air Force was allowed to keep only 6 squadrons in the unoccupied zone of the country. Each of these consisted of 24 MB.152 or MB.155 fighters. The air defense of the so-called Free Zone was strictly divided into sectors. Dedicated fighter groups were established in the southeast and southwest of the country. They consisted of both day and night squadrons. They were based in cities like Marignan, Salon de Provence, and Montpellier. Command kept a few additional units in reserve for emergencies. Units that ended up outside mainland France had a different fate. For example, a former naval aviation squadron relocated to North Africa. It was then redesignated. By September of that year, it had completely transitioned to the more advanced Dewoitine D-520 fighters. The aircraft factory in Châteauroux was initially captured by German troops. It eventually ended up inside the French Free Zone. Production of the Bloch MB.152 fighter came to a complete halt there on June 18th. Out of the first 10 aircraft built in this series, ferry pilots managed to save 8 by flying them south. The other 2 were destroyed on the ground during German air raids. Later on, under direct German orders, the factory assembled another 19 aircraft. They used parts that were already in the final stages of assembly. These fighters were handed over to the Vichy Armistice Air Force. Eventually, almost all of them entered service with French squadrons. There was only one exception, where one airframe became the personal mount for an air group commander. In April 1941, the German Armistice Commission made a major decision. They approved a proposal to standardize the fleet. This involved re-equipping all single-engine fighter units with a single aircraft type. The obvious choice was the highly capable French Dewoitine D-520. There is a fascinating, almost cloak-and-dagger detail in this story. Over the winter of 1941 and 1942, nearly 100 Bloch MB.152 fighters went through a secret upgrade so they could safely cross the Mediterranean Sea. To pull this off, an 18-gallon auxiliary fuel tank was installed in the rear fuselage of each aircraft. The transition to the new aircraft kicked off in late May 1942. The first unit successfully replaced its old Bloch fighters with brand new D-520s. By the end of June, several other air groups had followed suit. They completely upgraded their fleets. The Vichy Armistice Air Force was officially disbanded on November 27, 1942. At that point, its remaining inventory was quite a mixed bag, including 6 Bloch MB.151s, another 20 of these airframes upgraded to the MB.152 standard, and well over 200 MB.152 and MB.155 fighters. All of them were either distributed among a handful of squadrons or sitting in storage depots. When the Germans finally took over the remaining French aviation assets, the Luftwaffe captured 173 Bloch fighters. Out of that number, 83 turned out to be fully airworthy and combat-ready. However, whether Axis air forces actually used them in frontline combat remains a mystery. There are still no concrete historical records to confirm it.